This is the corner of Bay and Wellington Streets in downtown Toronto. It's just outside the old Toronto Stock Exchange, in many ways the centre of the city's old economy. For almost 50 years, members of the Grossman family sold newspapers here. They were well known to the Bay Street crowd. In December 1973, Anne Grossman retired. Her Bay Street friends celebrated with an impromptu party right here on the sidewalk. There was a cake, bouquets, an exchange vice president, a gaggle of newspaper managers, and the Toronto Star was there. The Star reporter asked Anne what had changed in her 18 years on this corner. Well, she said, as the tall buildings went up, the winds had increased. Anne Grossman had experienced what the climatologists call the urban canyon effect. The deep canyons between tall buildings can channel the wind, increasing both velocity and turbulence. Anne had spent the high-rise boom of the 60s selling papers as the TD Centre went up opposite. The growing urban canyon effect was quite obvious. It may be obvious to a newspaper seller, but the urban canyon effect hasn't been obvious to those who study the history of cities or their environments. Winds are basic environmental materiality. The urban climatologists know about them, but historians, it seems, do not. This presentation is an attempt to look at the historical geography of Toronto's wind canyons and to ask what happened and what we've overlooked by ignoring them. Colonial Toronto was laid out on a grid pattern, roughly oriented to the cardinal points of the compass. As the grid was built out, it tended to create a rectangular grid pattern of buildings. This suited bureaucratic tidiness, but it meant that one day winds could blow along linear canyons. Curving streets might have produced more shelter. For most of the 19th century, Toronto was a low-rise city, even downtown. By the 1850s, very little was more than 3 stories, and most of that was downtown. But even so, there's evidence of incipient wind canyons. One of the great summer nuisances of the Victorian city was street dust. The downtown core was built on the clays of an old glacial lake bed. In wet weather, the city's unpaved streets dissolved into mud. In dry weather, they broke into dust, whipped up by the wind and by street traffic. George Brown, editor of the Globe newspaper, complained in 1873 that when he walked along Queen Street, he encountered 3 or 4 dust clouds where major north-south streets intersected, and canyon-effect winds punched through and raised the dust, to the gentleman's discomfort. Quite often in the newspaper coverage of late Victorian windstorms, we see reference to downtown street corners as windy places. Although Victorian Toronto was still largely a low-rise city, the wind canyons were developing. In the early 20th century, they become much more obvious. Much of this was connected to the emergence of a new kind of building, the skyscraper. Before 1914, 90% of Canada's bond capital came from London. London was the world's great preeminent financial centre, and Toronto's economy operated in a London-centred universe. London capitalism built proud collections of low-rise buildings in banker classicism or banker Gothic. Its influential professional and business culture was accommodated in low to mid-rise structures. When London's money was transmogrified into banks and mercantile houses in Toronto and into its business culture, it tended to reproduce low to mid-rise London-style buildings in banker classicism, Gothic, or with bits of Italianate or Second Empire for variety. The arrival of skyscrapers marked not just a new form of architecture, but a great epochal shift in the flows of global capital. Skyscrapers were very American structures and arose from American business culture, its modalities and tastes. British visitors to Toronto saw the connection immediately. The CPR building, said one visiting Brit, was 17 stories of American efficiency. The skyscraper was a powerful symbol of the growing importance of American investment in Toronto's real estate, banks, businesses, and stock market. Toronto's first true skyscraper was the Temple Building, built in the 1890s by the International Order of Foresters. Financed by local capital, it was inspired by Chicago's State Street. The second iconic skyscraper was the Traders Bank Tower, a mid-Edwardian structure, built by an upstart bank which had strong ties to local capital. Skyscraper construction took off in Toronto from the mid-Edwardian period and continued until the Depression. As structures multiplied and the canyons grew, the canyon winds increased. Yonge Street between King and Cockburn was one of the first places to demonstrate powerful wind canyon effects. In 1909, a couple of years after the completion of the Traders Bank, we see reports of female pedestrians struggling in the wind on the street below as the canyon winds whipped at their skirts and disarranged their hair. The areas around the Temple Building were also problematic, and street photographer William James captured Edwardian commuters struggling across the intersection, holding their coats and hats. The canyon winds were also bad at King and Yonge, with gusts tugging at pedestrians. Even the sturdy bank messengers had to brace themselves. The construction of the CPR building in 1913-14 made wind conditions at the King-Yonge intersection much worse. Hats routinely blew off and went soaring upwards on rotational updrafts. Loafers gathered around the intersection on windy days just to watch the wind lift women's skirts and expose their ankles and stockings. During the First World War, soldiers and Highland regiments tried to cross the intersection wearing kilts with alarming results. Toronto journalists dubbed the intersection Canyon Corner, or the Cave of the Winds. In ordinary wind conditions, Canyon Corner was unpleasant, but in high winds it was getting dangerous. Pedestrians could not cross the intersection without assistance from sturdy police officers kept on hand for the purpose. Men and women were blown flat in the unexpected gusts. People had to walk backwards or work around the intersection through the Manning Arcade. News boxes were picked up and smashed against buildings. Bicycles parked at the curb were blown into the paths of streetcars. Plate glass windows blew out. Pedestrians were seriously injured by glass and flying debris. To kill a pedestrian, all you have to do is to knock them over on a hard urban surface. Measured in this respect, the wind canyon at King and Yonge had already reached the basic threshold of deadliness by 1914. As skyscrapers multiplied and spread across the downtown, the wind canyons spread with them. King and Bay Streets emerged as new skyscraper canyons in the 20s. Wind conditions weren't as bad as Canyon Corner, but it was getting windy. Papers blew around, clothing and hair was disarranged, and when there was a ticker tape parade, the papers spiraled in rotational updrafts. Through the Depression until about 1950, there was little fresh skyscraper construction in downtown Toronto, but from 1950 there was a massive surge in high-rise construction. As the downtown canyons deepened and spread once more, the wind canyons intensified. A massive iconic part of the 1960s construction boom was the TD Centre, built in phases at King and Bay. An exercise in high modernism, it created a huge open plaza in the heart of the city's canyon system. The construction of New City Hall created another plaza nearby. These were some of the city's grandest 1960s architectural statements, but almost immediately they became problematic for urban wind conditions. Commuters reaching the TD Centre were expected to climb steps from Wellington Street, stairs which originally were built without railings. The first winter, the winds were so bad, the building's management had to rig up climbing ropes so people could reach the towers, and eventually they installed proper handrails. The wind canyons downtown had become so notorious by the end of the 60s that they entered into the city's politics. In 1972, Toronto voted in the so-called Reform Council under David Crombie. There was a voter groundswell of disgust with the development excesses of the 60s. When asked for a quote on planning policy, the Reform Council members had an interesting soundbite. What did they want for downtown? No more windswept asphalt canyons, they said. The 1970s saw the beginning of planning interest in Toronto's wind canyons, but it achieved relatively little. The winds, however, continued to be problematic. In January 78, there was a severe winter windstorm. Windows were blown out of the TD Centre and Commerce Court. The TD Centre creaked in the wind, Commerce Court swayed. About 30 workers in the upper storeys of Commerce Court became seasick and cleared out the gravel from the drugstore in the basement. One of the windows of Commerce Court was blown out and carried across Bay Street, where it sliced through the window of the TD Centre, chopping a desk in half. The Toronto Star shows us what life was like for pedestrians in the city's wind canyons. Pedestrians clung to lampposts, walked backwards, fell, or were blown over all over the downtown. The winds killed 9 people in this storm. Similar scenes recurred in subsequent windy weather. The worst disaster occurred at the end of December 1982 at Nathan Phillips Square. There was a newly installed jogging track running around the City Hall dome, and a gust of wind picked up the track while a family of 4 was standing on it. They were blown over the wall and dropped onto the plaza 30 feet below, and then the jogging track landed on top of them. Everyone had broken bones. The 2 adults had spinal injuries. The father of the family was permanently paralyzed. When it was being designed, City Hall had been tested in a wind tunnel. This ensured that the structure would stand up to the wind, but nobody made any provision for pedestrians. Toronto's wind canyons reached the basic threshold of pedestrian deadliness in 1914 and have remained at this point for over a century. Deadly conditions have spread widely across the downtown. Most of the time, the winds aren't powerful enough to do much harm, but most of the time they are powerful enough to make the pedestrian experience unpleasant. Some of the city's most valuable public spaces, notably Nathan Phillips Square, have been rendered dysfunctional by the wind canyon effect. Neglected by scholars, Toronto's wind canyons have also been neglected by planners and politicians. There is a high price to pay for such ignorance. Overlooked or not, wind is part of the city's nature. It is a nature which already has a long and complicated cultural history.